UFOs, monsters, mysteries. You're listening to Talking Weird. And now, from a cabin deep in the Northwoods, your hosts, Dr. Dean Bertram and Jen Durrell.
Well, hello, baby.
Oh, hey, baby.
Happy May 1st. It's a May Day today, isn't that so?
Yes, it is.
Isn't there like doesn't the Wicker Man have like May 1st rituals and people dancing around maypoles?
I don't know.
I think it's has some significance on the Wiccan or the occult calendar. And I bet you our guest tonight, hailing originally from the British Isles, will probably be able to tell us a little bit more about May 1st or May Day traditions. So our guest is a British dark artist based in Los Angeles, specializing in horror and science fiction. His work often includes elements inspired by ancient cultures, folklore, legend, and the occult. His fascination with the supernatural, the paranormal, cryptozoology, and the unexplained has played a huge part in his work since his own childhood experiences growing up on the edge of a forest in England. He has created artwork for a variety of clients in both the rock and metal music scene and the world of comic book and graphic novels. Creating album covers, merchandise, and comic book covers for a variety of clients, including Rob Zombie, Slayer, Kiss, Clive Barker, Stan Lee, The X-Files, and Fangoria, to name just a few. His artwork can also be found on the covers of various books, films, and podcasts regarding cryptozoology and the paranormal by authors David Weatherly, Ken Gerhard, Joshua Kuchin, Joshua P. Warren, Whitley Strieber, David Hatcher-Childress, Shannon LeGros, and many more. He's been featured on the covers of several magazines and has appeared as a guest on various podcasts, such as Into the Fray, which I know is one of both of our favorites, you and mine, Jen, and Where Did the Road Go?, another excellent podcast, the Micah Hanks Program, and Coast to Coast AM. His own podcast launches this year, and I'm super looking forward to that, and it's split into seasons, with the first covering ghosts, hauntings, and things that go bump in the night. So without any further ado, I'm delighted to welcome tonight's guest, Mr. Sam Shearon. Sam, thank you so much for joining us.
How are you doing? Hello.
Good. We were just chatting a little bit about May Day, and I bet you're the person who'd be able to fill us in on some May Day or 1st of May lore coming from the British Isles.
Maybe. I don't know. I think everyone's sort of at the moment, it's a bit of a popular thing to spin around over Instagram and everything. Everyone's saying it's halfway to Halloween. So it's the sort of witches' Sabbath celebrations of, the beginning of a whole new season, that kind of thing. But yeah, Wicker Man, you mentioned there, one of my favorite films of all time. The original, of course. I haven't even seen the Nick Cage version. I'm not sure I want to. But yeah, the Wicker Man, Christopher Lee. That is an amazing film, legend.
And Edward Woodward is so phenomenal in that role. He just seems so sincere and so shocked by everything that happens to him.
Yeah, it's fantastic. It's absolutely brilliant. Yeah, Edward Woodward, Ewa Woo Woo, if you take all the D's away. He's gone now, isn't he, though? He's passed away a couple of years ago, I think.
I think so. My brother was such a fan of his. I remember The Equalizer was a massive show in the 80s.
Yeah,
he was such a badass. Yeah, he's this kind of, very British kind of, it was all about this implied threat. And then when violence had to be used, it was just like a hammer. It was, spectacular.
Absolutely brilliant. Yeah. I don't know if you're familiar with Simon Pegg and Nick Frost.
Oh, absolutely.
They did the movie Hot Fuzz, which was sort of loosely based around the Wicker Man kind of setup. And Edward Woodward was in that film as a sort of a main character kind of thing. That's such a brilliant little tie-in.
Yeah, funnily enough, I'm really influenced by The Wicker Man as well. I have a feature film in post-production called Virgin Forest, which never would have come into play if it hadn't been for The Wicker Man and other folk horror like that. There's always something very powerful. And I guess it's a crossover into my interest in the paranormal and the like as well, about older traditions that come back to somehow bite us in modernity, or to bite the modern interloper into older, cultural areas or traditions. It's a fascinating subgenre of horror, really.
Absolutely. I mean, every season, I'm a big fan of all the different seasons, and everyone sort of says, Halloween is their favorite kind of thing, but Christmas is so much darker. There's so many more, creepy stories and legends and ghost stories. Phenomenal. Just scores and scores of tales from the Christmas and winter periods, more so than Halloween. Halloween's just sort of 3 days. That's about it. And then, of course, today and tomorrow sort of thing. But yeah, all of the seasons, even the summer, all of the different pagan and original sort of religions from thousands of years ago that have been butchered and remodeled. And now in America, obviously, in Halloween, people just dress up as anything. And that kind of loses the point of Halloween for me anyway. For me, it's sort of, Halloween's supposed to be scary. And yet you have people dressing up as their favorite TV show character or a president or something. And it misses the point. It's almost like it's now an excuse just to dress up. And to me, that's not Halloween.
No, I agree. I think for a lot of women, particularly college-age women too, it's just an excuse to look sexy in something that you might be able to wear every other day.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
I now live in the Midwest, and I grew up in Sydney, Australia, obviously, but the Midwest feels to me, because I grew up on films like John Carpenter's Halloween and shows like Happy Days, which doesn't sound scary, but they had a Halloween episode. And so the Midwest to me was always attached to Halloween. So to live here now, to take my daughter trick-or-treating in a very small town, like I live in the woods, the closest town to us is only 900 people. And to go there, I think it still has that modernization, but I think it's more of the 1970s modernization. Like I can imagine the streets haven't changed that much, and there isn't a whole lot of exaggerated big Halloween decorations. It still has a little bit of that creepier tone that I think you're talking about, which is nice.
Oh yeah. And it's sort of it's being washed away in so much commercialism, and yet the sort of the online Instagram witch community, if you will, that's this. It's almost as though it's become kind of a you have your musical trends like grunge and punk and all of the different types of music. It's almost as though witchcraft has become a sort of trend without music. And it's, you can get merchandise and mass-produced paraphernalia and all these witch memes and things. And again, it sort of misses the point, really, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think whenever there's an excuse to popularize or commercialize something, there's somebody out there who's going to make a buck off it. That's the sad reality.
Yeah. And you can't sort of complain. A lot of people, they sort of, if they discover a band and then one of their friends has already been into that band for years, you always get that kind of grumpy chip on the shoulder, like, you're not allowed to like this band because I've liked them for a decade already, And yet the same sort of thing's happening now with cryptozoology and UFOs and ghosts, because it's all over television, it's all over popular culture and the internet. There's a million podcasts popping up, mine, yours, everybody else's. And all this merchandise and all these toys and products and stuff based on these creatures. And of course, these TV shows, they always get it wrong as well. So they're sort of perpetuating these inaccurate stories and representations. It's kind of mind-numbing in a way. But
it is.
For the longest time, we wanted to be recognized in the mainstream media. And now we are. We don't want them to be because they're getting it wrong.
That's a good segue to tell us a little bit about your upcoming podcast, which I'm looking super forward to.
Well, I'm not going to reveal the name just yet. It's sort of up in the air because things can change. And I don't want to speak too soon, Big believer in the universe changing things last minute. But basically, it's coming from the sort of area of the umbrella term of the unexplained, and splitting it into different seasons rather than covering a different topic every episode, which is fine. And a lot of podcasts do that. I wanted to sort of come from it as a sort of a journey covering each subject fully as much as possible before moving on to the next one. And that can sound a little bit laborious and maybe boring. But what I want to do is something that's really never been done before, and that's absolutely strip everything away from the very beginning and then lead into the next subject from something that does link together. Because as we know, the unexplained all seem to interweave with each other. You know, you have stories of Bigfoots walking out of UFOs and then UFOs appearing as ghost-like lights, and it all seems to be the same thing in some
Yeah.
way. So really the podcast is kind of looking at it from a more documentary kind of aspect, stripping things apart more than anything. So yeah, it won't be like a talk show or anything like that. Again, it'll just be me dissecting everything that I can possibly find on one thing at a time. And the first season will be ghosts and hauntings, things that go bump in the night. But as I say, that can mean anything. You know, that can include vampires or, you know, the undead in general.
Yeah, there is. I like that you made the point that there is that interconnectedness between this phenomenon. And I mean, I'm very much influenced by people like John Keel and Jacques Vallée and Patrick Harper, who look at the phenomenon as the phenomenon, that there isn't that distinction between Bigfoot and UFOs and ghosts, and that maybe there's a root source, which is the same thing that makes your dearly departed grandmother appear in the family estate's back hallways as it does a light in the sky or as it does a Bigfoot in the woods. And I think it's nice to see some of those ideas come to the forefront. And it actually staggers me, and I'm not being critical of people, but it does stagger me that today, where there's a lot of people who identify as Forteans because they have an interest in more than just UFOs or more than just ghosts, or they are interested in all of these things, that some people still hold to a belief system or a structure where they still like to divide these things, where they still like to see Bigfoot as a hairy man-ape, and they still like to see a UFO as something from planet Zeta Reticula, and they still like to see a specter as, you know, the ghostly manifestation of the dearly departed. Now, obviously, none of us really know what any of this stuff is, but I think when you start looking between the phenomena, you begin to see similarities, and you begin to see things manifesting within the same story. Like somebody who has a UFO experience later might be haunted by poltergeist activity, or somebody, as you know all of this, somebody who sees a Bigfoot the same night might also see a weird orb floating through the woods or whatever. So I'm fascinated that your show's taking a holistic approach to it by the sounds of things.
Yeah. I mean, as you say there, you know, it's sort of reading between the lines with a lot of things that most people will skip over because they try and box it or label it into one category, and then they seal it up and that's done. It's on the shelf. And as we know, there's far more to it than that. And we don't know all the answers, and we never will know all the answers. And it's impossible to pretend that, you know, there's any way of cataloging anything. And you can even compare it to nature itself, if you want to call it supernature in this case, or what have you. Everything is continually evolving. So if you look at a family tree of animals, if you just take the primates, for example, we have a situation here where it's quite possible that Bigfoot, Sasquatch, or what have you, is on the family tree of all of the great apes. And yet there's no real connecting branch that we have in the fossil record that we can really speak of that directly links us into reality, because there's no specimen, there's no type specimen to check all of the DNA trails and the bone structures. There just isn't there. But that's not to say it doesn't exist. There are no fossil records of chimpanzees. There just isn't. Yet, you know, people have this, you know, dumbass view where they're saying, well, we can't have evolved from monkeys because there's still monkeys. And, you know, that inane, ignorant argument is missing the point again. You know, the family tree is forever branching out. And there may be one specific origin, but from that origin, that was a branch in itself from another tree. And we know it goes back far and far. So in terms of the unexplained, everything is interconnected. And without being too, you know, spiritualistic or super woo-woo and universe, it is that sort of, what do you call it? The interconnected web of the universe looks just like a brain with all the signals firing off and everything. And people saying, you know, it's the same as the spiral appears in nature throughout. Everything has the same blueprint. And if we can apply that blueprint to the unexplained, it might give us some idea of how things are connected. And my hope is that, if anything, this podcast will be in itself considered somewhere that you can use as a resource, even just to find more questions. Because I'm not going to go out there and say I have all the answers. I'll be going out there to dig up more questions.
Yeah.
And some people might find that more annoying than anything else, because they're not going to get to the bottom of it if they listen to me. But what they will do is it might spark off a little synapses in their brain to think, oh, well, that gives me an idea about this.
Yeah.
And hopefully I might push someone else further than me, connecting things that I maybe, most likely probably won't have even thought of myself. So that's the aim.
No, I think that's excellent. I think we need to suggest ways forward and new ways of looking at it, and new ways of encouraging, as you were saying, that listeners of your show might take a different approach, because the traditional approach, I think, whether it's in ufology or whether it's in spectre hunting or whether it's in cryptozoology, has always wanted to marry itself to science. But of course, the great esoteric traditions and romantic traditions of the West, and also of the Islamic world, for example, Henry Corbin writes about the imaginal, and tracing all the way to Charles Fort, is that these things aren't necessarily explainable with the scientific method. In fact, science tends to fail again and again when we try to open this box for various reasons. So it kind of bothers me, to be honest, that there's such a desire for all these different groups that investigate that I just mentioned to be welcomed into science. They so badly want a body so they'll be accepted, or they so badly want, a piece of a flying saucer, or they so badly want that irrefutable ghost photo that all of a sudden the scientific world will open up and welcome them. But as Fort taught us, that isn't the way that science works. These things are excluded. They're not part of the paradigm, as Thomas Kuhn talked about later. The entire paradigm has to shift. And it isn't that I don't think the scientific method today, and maybe ever, is going to be capable of looking at the unexplainable, as you mentioned that it is. Because it's unknown, but it's inexplicable at some level. And maybe that fulfills some, and now I'm getting a little artsy and deep, but maybe that fulfills some kind of mythological purpose or psychological purpose in itself, the unexplainable nature of some of these things, I think.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's hard not to sort of, as you say there, let your mind go off into a spiritualist sense, as I mentioned earlier. It's hard not to go there in your mind, and you can kind of forgive people who say, well, then there must be a God. I mean, I myself, I was raised as an atheist, and I still am. But there's always that thing in the back of your mind, isn't there? Because we are so still very primitive in the ways that we just simply don't understand everything, and we're not supposed to, we're not meant to, or there is no way of knowing currently. And so, as you say, it's hard not to sort of go to that length of, has this all been designed? I'm not sure. It's all a little bit too convenient in many places. But then I always use the argument of, well, if it wasn't, it wouldn't be. Everything happens for a reason, is that common sort of get out clause thing, isn't it? People say it as a bit of a luck saying, well, good things will come out of it. Don't worry about it. Everything's balanced. And there is truth in that. And people have been saying it for hundreds of years. But everything does happen for a reason, because if it didn't, it wouldn't. So, when people say, oh, everything's a miracle, it's not. It just is. It just is. Because if it isn't, it isn't, and wasn't, and couldn't be.
Well, I was listening to an interview with you, which I don't often do because I like to come at most of my guests not being influenced by other things I've heard them say. But I wasn't sure as much about your background as somebody who, for example, might have been on, a TV show about cryptozoology or had written a book on UFOs or something. And I was obviously fascinated by many of your tales. But one of the experiences I was most interested in was that you've actually been to Ape Canyon.
Yeah.
What a thrill.
If anything, it was, God, it links to so many things, because I went on a road trip all the way up the Pacific Coast Highway, and then just continued on all the way up Oregon, Washington, camped along the way, various places. And there was, Mount Rainier was on the route as well. And the scarier thing about that, rather than Ape Canyon, was it was me and my girlfriend at the time had we'd driven to Mount Rainier to basically look for Bigfoot, just putting it out there to begin with. But I've said in the past, I've never seen one. Just before anyone gets their hopes up listening to this, there's no story where I'm like, oh, there he was. No, it didn't happen. But when we got there, this sensation of pure dread is the most palpable, beyond hairs on the back of your neck sticking up, feeling of being watched. Just the absolute DNA level sensation of you are in mortal danger. You need to leave was just flowing through the pair of us, that we didn't even get out of the car, and we actually left. We didn't even hike that day. What happened was we'd pulled up to these sort of guard huts at the entrance of where you can sort of leave your car and then hike off into the wilderness, Mount Rainier areas, all the forests and stuff. And it was a really drizzly day, and it was almost dark. It was that overcast. And there was a real sort of moisture in the air. It was just about to rain, had been raining kind of. Everything was damp already. And we thought, oh, this would be nice. It'll be fresh. We can hear everything crystal clear. And we pulled up, and the guard huts where you sort of, you pay your parking or whatever, or you just registered to say that you're there so that if you go missing, they know who it was, kind of thing. The lights were on, but there was no one home. And it's not a euphemism or anything. It was like literally the lights were on, but there wasn't anyone there. And we thought, well, this is odd. Let's just wait 5 minutes. Maybe they're in the bathroom or something. And they didn't come back. There was no one around. And we were there about a good 20 minutes. And she was saying, well, my girlfriend was like, oh, okay, well, we'll just drive in anyway. We'll pay on the way out or whatever. I'm sure it's fine. And I said, no, I don't know. Something's not right. And we sort of turned the car off and looked around, and you could hear a pin drop. And there was this depth of field of just pure dread that was just eking out of this forest in front of us. And it was all dark, and it seemed to be getting darker, even though it was the middle of the day.
Jeez.
And this lasted for a good 10 minutes. And I was waiting to see something, walk out. It had that sensation of there's something here watching us. And, I'm not particularly a scaredy cat. I'm not saying I'm Conan the Barbarian, but, I was quite happy to just walk off and traipse in, a forest as you do. But there was something about this where it was just, no, time to leave. This is not good. And I have no idea what that was now. I'm always kicking myself. I got back to England because at the time I was living in England. And I told my mum about it. And she said, oh, didn't you do that at Ape Canyon as well? And I said, oh, yeah, because we'd heard something up over the ravine that sounded like a grizzly bear singing opera. And we got in the car and left again. And my mum said, don't you want to see Bigfoot? What's wrong with you? Why do you keep leaving? And yeah, you do. You kick yourself and you think, oh, I should have just stuck around. But there's something about it, just the oppressive dread of you're in danger. You need to leave. Just go. Was absolutely apparent. But yeah, the Ape Canyon thing, again, didn't see anything. Heard something, but I can't say what that was. No idea.
You speaking about this change in light and this building sense of dread or apprehension when you're at Mount Rainier, it makes me think of some of the David Paulides type stories. I wonder if maybe you did the right thing by fleeing. You might joke about it now, but what might have happened if you hadn't fled? Well,
that's the thing. And, I'm familiar with him. We'd had him, David Paulides, that is, on Into the Fray in the early days. He was one of our first guests, and his body of work, his studies are fascinating. For anyone who doesn't know, the 411 is code for info. So it's missing info. Missing 411 is his book series. I think he's done about 10 books, including 2 books on Bigfoot. But he doesn't really talk about Bigfoot when he's talking about the missing 411. He's very clever about not mixing his subjects there, because I don't think he wants to lead people to any conclusion. He likes to make the point and the facts out there for them to draw their own conclusions. But at the same time, he does seem to leave out certain details, perhaps cherry pick things that fit his paradigm of that particular topic. So maybe if someone saw a Bigfoot and went missing, he'll leave that part out because it doesn't fit his missing story. He'd rather just have the missing part. That's as far as I'm aware, anyway. It does seem to sort of suggest that all of this is connected, and maybe he doesn't want it to be connected because, in that sense, maybe someone will figure something out from a different angle. I'm not sure why, but he does leave the Bigfoot aspect out these days. Very interesting. Very strange.
It is interesting because his background was, you're right, it was a Bigfoot researcher before he did the Missing 411 book. So when he first came out with Missing 411, I think I jumped to the conclusion, like a lot of people did, that Polito is going to do this reveal that it's Bigfoot. Because remember that one of the most haunting stories, I think in the first book, or one of the first books, was about the boy who was playing hide and seek with other kids. I think it was on the Appalachian Trail, and he went behind a bush and then he was just gone. And the father ran down the trail like as fast as he could, thinking this could be, and he never found the kid. But a number of days later, or maybe even later that day, witnesses, I don't know, a few miles down the trail said that they'd seen what looked like a hairy man running through the woods with something on his shoulders. It still creeps me out to tell that story. It really bothered me when I read it. And so I thought early on, okay, he's a Bigfoot researcher. There's this story which got a lot of press on things like Coast to Coast. It was always the story he talked about. So I thought the reveal was going to be it was a Bigfoot thing. But then you're right. He seems to have backed further away from being comfortable to have any conclusion about what the root cause is of these disappearances, which he seems to suggest are being so similar that it must be the same source behind the disappearances.
I mean, he's very clever in a sense that he's leaving it wide open to include any, UFOs or anything, time slips, even, all of this kind of stuff, fae folk and little dimensional doorways. Who knows? But he never specifies. He never suggests. He leaves it to everybody else who's into those fringe, albeit very connected little jigsaw pieces, to sort of make their own minds up. And I like that about his work. It's very, very cleverly written.
I like that too.
Yeah, I'm not sure what's going on, but the idea of dread, people have suggested the actual ley lines and fault lines of earthquake movement, that can send up all kinds of electrical signals from the earth below you, can affect how you feel, and there's any number of explanations. But in terms of people going missing, I remember there being a story where there was a couple of boys had gone missing and they were lost, but they looked over a ravine. They could see the party that they were with. I don't know if it was their parents or a scout group, and they were sort of waving their arms and shouting, but the other people couldn't hear them, but they could hear them very clearly, and they were like, "We're here, hey," and nobody could see them or hear them, and they followed them and managed to catch up with them and said, "Hey, didn't you see us? Didn't you hear us?" And they said, "No," and they said maybe 100 yards away, nothing, but they couldn't get to them because it was over like a ravine, and it makes you wonder what's going on. I was hiking the other day with my girlfriend here in Los Angeles. We're going all the different hiking trails through the hills, and one day I was sort of a little hot and out of breath, and we were stood at the top of this mountain, and these two girls were sort of hiking past, and they were maybe 25, 30 feet away from us, and they didn't see us. They didn't notice. Now, I'm not saying there's anything paranormal going on there. There wasn't. They literally had no idea that we were there. And I said to my girlfriend, "Don't say anything, just stay quiet, to see if they notice us, just as an experiment." And we were wearing hiking gear. It wasn't as though we were camouflaged or anything, And the trail was very open, just a couple of bushes and mountains either side. And we had stepped off the trail, as I say, maybe 20, 30 feet. And they went, jogging up and past us, and they had no idea we were there. And I said to my girlfriend, Jen, I said, we could have been two Bigfoot stood here and they wouldn't have seen us. So it makes you wonder how many times people have gone through with things that are purposefully trying to hide. We weren't. We were just standing there and weren't seen. So for all the animals that are very, very good at this, it's no wonder that, most people say, even these hunters who say, "Oh, I've been doing it for all my life and I've never seen one." Well, of course you haven't, You're wearing bright orange for a start.
It's interesting talking about hunters and invisible Bigfoot and missing 411 because there's that fascinating story in Polito's Missing 411 Hunters where it's Bruce Maccabee's the optical physicist's wife who's out hunting in a tree stand, and she sees that figure move through the trees in front of her that looks almost like the Predator from when it's got the cloaking device on in the Predator movies.
Yeah.
And then I think simultaneously, I think their children or their grandchildren or somebody are playing in a school band, like at the school auditorium. And I think they might see a light in the sky or something at the same time as well. So there's definitely something very strange going on, which is beyond a more, I think, mundane explanation of any of these things.
Yeah. And again, it's one giant sort of stew that you could add any ingredient with. And at the beginning, it's just a rock, isn't it? And, the old folkloric, legendary fairy tale, if you will, where it's stone stew, where they say, oh, it just needs a little bit of salt, okay, we'll get some salt, just needs a little bit of broccoli maybe. And then you just add and add and add. And then you have this amazing stew of stuff when really you boil it all down, it's just a rock. I think too many people add too many details, probably without even thinking. It's just a natural storytelling facet, isn't it, of how we communicate to someone else. A description can only be from our own language of what we know and words that we use. So we're going to add things to dress it up to better convey what we experience. And in doing so, the person hearing that word may have a different interpretation of that word. And you've heard the children's game telephone, or a kid will whisper one thing and then it goes round in a circle and then it's completely different by the end of it. In England, we called that, when we were at school, we called that Chinese whispers.
We did in Australia too.
Very racist sort of today, looking at it, which I find fascinating. But it was purely based on the idea that you don't understand the language. There's nothing meaning horrible about that. It wasn't racist, but it's not an accepted term these days. But the same thing's going on with strange stories. People are adding things or mishearing it, and you end up with this crazy story about invisible people who can send you through time and who knows what. I don't know. It's crazy.
I think that feeds into the mythology, though. Then too is the great irony, because there's a cultural expectation, I think, in a lot of what we experience when we have an encounter with the anomalous. So, for example, if I'd seen a strange light in the back of my woods 100 years ago, I wouldn't have thought it was a landed flying saucer, but today conceivably myself or somebody else might. Back then they might have thought it was a witch's light or a ghost light or who knows what. So we tend to project those expectations onto it.
Yeah, again, it only can come from what we know in the language we use. As you say, someone might see it as fairies, other people 100 years later see it as little flying saucer people. And it's all culturally driven. 100 years from now, we'll see it as something else. It'll be Elon Musk's children. Who knows?
Has your interest in the paranormal and cryptozoology and all things weird been a constant intersection within your artwork as well? Is it something that's informed the way that you see the world and then translated as an artist, do you think?
Yeah, very much so. I think growing up in England and sort of in the towns that I did, there were beautiful, really inspirational places, old Victorian buildings. Before that, an old forest, and it really plays into, your worldview when you start hearing about natural history and branches of natural history and supernature and all the paranormal things to it. That as a kid, I originally wanted to be a vet because I was fascinated with wildlife and natural history. And I used to go to the museums in Liverpool, Lime Street, and sit under the big dinosaur skeletons, and I was just fascinated. But then when I started reading stories about monsters being real, in a sense that could be surviving dinosaurs in the Congo and that kind of thing, it really started to be a huge eye-opening shift in what I wanted to be when I grew up. And I thought, well, I want to go and look for these, or I want to illustrate these, or be a part of this. And that feeds into the Loch Ness Monster. And then you get older and you find out that, well, there couldn't possibly be a plesiosaur living in a loch. The loch didn't even exist 65 million years ago, and that kind of thing. So how could it still be there? Because you go down that whole road, you start to realize that there are more truths that are stranger than these legends and folkloric tales, that you start digging into the tales and finding out what is the truth of those origins of those stories. And you find that stone in that stew. And sometimes you find it's a nice nugget of gold and you think, wow, that's a great story. I'm going to retell that and I'm going to illustrate that. And sometimes you just think, well, it's crazy, but, it's a really interesting creature. I'm going to illustrate it anyway. But yeah, all of my artwork has always been based on something that fascinates me rather than a bowl of fruit or a kitten. Who wants to draw
that? I've always been fascinated with dinosaur relics in cryptozoology as well. So the Mekele Mbembe. We had a wonderful French director on the show, I don't know, half a dozen episodes ago, maybe more, called Alexandre Brecheur, and he went on an expedition to the Congo. He made this wonderful film called The Explorer, when I think he traveled with a cryptozoologist called, I think, Michel Talbot or somebody is his name, and they went, it was wonderful to see them going and looking for this creature. But the most fascinating thing about the documentary was, to me at least, was that it was more about the struggle of looking for it. Like, they could have been looking for an endangered rhino. It was about how hard it was to go into these regions. And I think because those regions are so difficult to get to, there's something about it. I don't really think there's a brontosaur in the Congo, but you know what? I'm more likely to accept that as a physical reality than I am, as you were mentioning, to accept that there's a plesiosaur in Loch Ness. Like, those big amounts of unexplored, untrod jungles in Africa, who knows what's in there? So that's where cryptozoology to me starts to make a little more practical sense, that there might be things which we haven't discovered in those more remote areas.
Well, absolutely. You've got you're talking about the Congo there, the Likoela swamp with Mekele Mbembe's. That swamp is 50,000 square miles, I believe. And it's just the swamp itself. And so, and it's bordered by 3 different countries in the Congo, which is a war-torn zone. You can't even get in there if you wanted to. You have to beg the government and have a permit for sneaking in. And then even if you get in touch with the people who live there, they'll only take you so far because it's dangerous for them beyond that to even survive. And even if you have the money for the equipment, they're terrified and superstitious about the animal that lives there. So yeah, the idea of anything surviving, or even, let's be realistic, if you want to look at it from natural history, yes, I would agree. It's not going to be a brontosaurus stomping through the swamps, but it could be an evolutionary descendant, perhaps something that's very much in the same shape, but is now 65 million years later a completely different animal. It just sort of resembles a dinosaur, what we would call the dinosaur. Maybe it's just a giant monitor lizard with a long neck. Who knows? But yeah, I absolutely agree. The idea that we've tackled and discovered every animal is it's just ignorant, isn't it? It's impossible to sort of pinpoint how many species are discovered every year. You can't quantify it. It's unknown, but every year it happens. 100 new species, and we're talking about large mammals as well in the ocean, new dolphins. You look at even the United States. I think there was a ridiculous figure, like there's only 5% of North America as the states that's populated. The rest of it is wilderness, mountains. 5%.
Staggering.
So when people say, America's America, yay, James Brown and all that jazz, and it's all highways and skyscrapers. No, it isn't. It isn't at all. It's very, very much still the Wild West. You've got the East Coast and the West Coast, and then a bunch of stuff in the middle, and then a bunch of mad people, and then a bunch of people. I'm not going to say where they are, but they're everywhere. And then the rest is just filled in with trees and mountains and deserts. So to think that we've, discovered everything and pinpointed or even trodden it with our bare feet, we haven't. And that's just America. Think about Russia. Good God, the vastness of that. Unbelievable. Unbelievable.
Yeah.
There could be tribes of Neanderthal up there and we wouldn't know.
Well, what is the Russian? There is one. What's the Russian Yeti or the Russian Bigfoot?
Well, you've
What's
got the Almasty, haven't you?
That's it. Yeah.
Wild man, the Almasty, which a lot of people say is surviving Neanderthal, and it's entirely possible. I mean, at one point there were 7 different types of hominin running around the world, and we were all competing with each other. There was really, as a fact, 9 feet tall people. Australopithecus, is it? The largest one is 9 to 10 feet tall people actually walking around, albeit slightly smaller brains, perhaps, a little bit more ape-like. But then you think, is that Bigfoot? Have they survived? Were they actually hairy? We don't know. We don't have anything but a few bones, but we know that they did exist. And so in northern Russia, yeah, we could have tribes of Neanderthal men walking around, which today we call Almasty. Who knows? Or they could just be mad people.
Yeah.
And of course, my daughter at the moment she's been fascinated with dinosaurs for years, but one of the things she's interested in, and probably has been for about the last 6 months, the ropens, the pterosaur type creatures in New Guinea, because she loves dinos. So for her to think that there might still be, a relic out there that's a pterodactyl, she's obsessed with that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Especially across America, there's the old legend of the Thunderbird, and then you have all the different types of those. You have your giant eagles and your prehistoric teratons that could be surviving, eagles that carry off people, and there's the supposedly pterodactyl type, or pterosaurs rather. Apparently pterodactyl doesn't exist. Did you know that?
No, but I know they often reset dino definitions. Like Brontosaurus is really the Apatosaurus or something.
Yeah, but now there's 3 Brontosaurus. It's like that it didn't exist and then it did, and there's actually 3 of those. Okay. And you think, what the hell? So yeah, Thunderbirds, I absolutely accept that they're out there. Why not? There's so much territory we haven't seen. They could be gliding around right now and you wouldn't know, because who looks up? Everyone's looking at their phones these days. So.
Oh yeah.
I don't have a cell phone. I'm probably one of the few.
You don't?
Yeah.
Really?
I have had cell phones. I don't have a cell phone at the moment.
Could I ask why? Is there any reason?
I don't like to. No, I just don't like to be plugged in constantly. It's It's and also, to be honest, I work from home, so I have a landline. So I don't need to have a cell phone when I go to the store. I don't need a.
Right.
When I run a film festival called Midwest Weird Fest, and usually when I run that, I make sure I buy like a disposable cell for a month, because filmmakers need to get in touch with me. I'm not at home, I'm at it. But most of the year, I don't want one.
Wow. So you're sort of a James Bond kind of character then?
No, not at all. When I was in Sydney, I was plugged in constantly. I had my iPhone with me everywhere, but my lifestyle now is a little quieter.
Do you know Kung Fu?
I do know Kung Fu, yeah.
Oh, you do? Wow.
Yeah, I did Wing Chun for many years in Sydney.
There you go. And I'm going to say that you are a secret agent, but of course you can't tell us.
I'll be honest.
Phones. Yeah. Okay.
I was a private investigator for a number of years as well, but that wasn't for the government.
Is that what they call it? Oh, okay. Got you. Yeah. All right. Secret safe for me.
Well, yeah, with you and everybody watching us in the live stream, I can cut it out of the audio podcast that goes out as well. Exactly. So just keep it to the people watching. Live. Now, Jen's somebody who's fascinated with her particular interest, I guess, is she's a paranormal investigator and a sensitive. You've got to have questions for Sam or ghostly things before I steal the entire, particularly because that's going to be the first season of this podcast.
Well, yeah. I mean, have you had any experiences with ghosts or shadow people or anything like that?
Many.
Okay.
Yeah. I laugh because I don't know where to start. It's one of those things where when I decided to do a podcast, originally, I was co-hosting with Shannon LeGros and Ryan Sprague, and we did Into the Fray, and then we all got busy and did our own things. But even from that point on, I was thinking, okay, at some point I'm going to do my own spin-off or my own podcast, and it was no question it had to begin with ghosts because of all of the experiences I've had. As much as my interest is, I would probably sway more into cryptozoology than the paranormal and ghosts and the afterlife and that kind of thing. I haven't really had any encounters, so to speak, of cryptozoology as much as I would know probably more about that than ghosts. I've had more ghost experiences or things that I would put into that category, which is, I suppose, another reason why I really wanted to attack it and pull it apart for the first season. So I can sort of put it to rest myself, put a stake in it, whatever you want to call it. But it all sort of, I guess you could say the first experience was when I was a kid, age 7, and I literally had 2 Victorian children walk into my room, and it's so strange to retell it because I've tried to pull it apart and look at it over the years as, could have been this, could have been that, could have been this. And there's just from the back of my mind straight away, there's no way I can get around the fact that my mum was there. And to this day, she won't talk about it. So just really sort of to recap and go over it, it was my aunt and uncle that was staying over, who you could sort of say, okay, they're male and female, so is that going to play into why I saw a male and female ghost, albeit they were children? I've sort of tried to wrap my head around that. But they had come to visit, and it was maybe 10, 11 at night. I was sent to bed because it was pretty late for me. I was 7 years old, so my mum was like, come on, that's it, time for bed. And I was wide awake because I was excited. My uncle had visited. He brought a buck on dinosaurs for me, I was like, oh yeah, it's great to see you. So I didn't want to go to bed. I was wide awake. And we had a small house on the edge of a forest, just me and my mum. And so I could hear the television downstairs pretty clear. So I couldn't really sleep. I was listening to that, and there was like clinking of glasses, people chatting away. And, it wasn't as though I was being kept awake by them. It was just like I was kind of earwigging because I wanted to be down there. I could hear it all going on, so I was very much aware that I was awake looking back. And I sort of thought, well, I'm not going to be allowed to go downstairs. I can't just go downstairs because I'll just be sent back to bed again. So I'll just sort of turn over. And I sort of, in a grumpy way, turned and just sort of faced the wall, but I could still hear the TV and talking and stuff through the floor. And then I turned back again. And there was my aunt and uncle stood in the doorway. And I had the whole light on, shining behind them. And so they were silhouette. And I was really happy that they'd come to say goodnight, because I didn't think I was going to see them the morning they were leaving early kind of thing. So I sat up and I was like, oh, yeah, it was great to see you. Thanks for the dinosaur book, good night. I don't know if I'll see you in the morning, sleep well. And they didn't answer. And I sort of sat up and I rubbed my eyes. I was trying to focus on them because they were silhouetted. I couldn't see them from the hall light behind them. And that's when I realized that they were actually a lot shorter than they should have been. And this sort of, kind of feeling went over me, and they started to walk into the room like almost immediately. And that's when the light changed because they walked at an angle, and I sort of caught a glimpse of them, and they were not my aunt and uncle. It was a boy and a girl, and they were maybe my age, but they had frilly clothes on, and I screamed the house down and threw my pillow sort of at them, and they were just coming towards me, and I thought, I didn't want to look at them. I was so horrified. I looked up, and this is where it gets really, really weird, because if that's not weird enough, me not wanting to look at them, I look up, I avert my eyes away. I couldn't even close my eyes because, you want to keep looking in a sense of danger.
Yeah.
You don't want to shut your eyes. I look up away from them at the ceiling, very much aware of them coming towards me still. And on the ceiling, there is this football size or soccer ball size green ball of fire. and it is going around the room, all corners of the ceiling, sort of in a circular motion around the room. And every time I'm looking up at it, it sort of sweeps down towards me. And I sort of like turn my head away from it because I don't want to get hit by this green ball of fire. And it's almost forcing me to look at them. And I don't want to look again. So I look back up and I see this ball of fire going around the ceiling, and then it comes back at me again. And the whole time I'm screaming, "Mom, Mom."
Mm-hmm.
And she comes, running in the room, stops, looks around, runs over to me, grabs me by the arm, pulls me out of bed, slams my bedroom door, and we all slept downstairs that night. And moved house shortly after. And it was a case of my mum the next day saying that I'd had a bad dream when I knew I was awake. Mm-hmm. And then about 2 or 3 years later, I asked her, we were visiting my grandmother, and something had come up, and it just, reminded me. And I said to my mum, "Oh, Mum, yeah, do you remember that night? Such and such, blah, blah, blah." And my mum said, "I don't want to talk about it." And I said, "Why not? Come on, let's, you remember the thing, right? What was going on? And you said it was a bad dream, but I don't think it was." And my mum said, "Look, I'm not going to talk about it again. Don't ask me about it again, because I don't like it. But all I can say is that there was something going on in your room that night that I didn't understand, and I just knew I had to get you out of there. And don't ask me again." And to this day, she won't talk about it. So who knows what that was? But yeah, it wasn't very nice. And so that was my earliest experience of anything that really shouldn't have been in the house. Pretty horrible.
Yeah. Have you ever tried to, check on the history of that location, or?
All I know is the town itself is called Murdershaw. I know that sounds creepy in itself.
Yeah.
It's spelled differently, but it's phonetically it's Murdershaw, but it's Murdishaw. But in Murdershaw, apparently a couple of 100 years ago, it was the capital of the area where people were taken to be hung. And the forest that was on the edge of our house they would hang them from the trees, kind of thing, because it was cheaper than making gallows, and it was quicker and that kind of thing. So who knows whether the forest was haunted or whether it was anything to do with that. Everywhere I think is haunted. Everywhere has its history.
Yeah.
How can it? How can it not be? I'm just waiting for people to walk around, wearing tracksuits and haunting places. 80s. That's another strange thing about ghosts. It's always someone from the past, isn't it? It's not someone from 2004 singing Oasis or something. It's really strange.
No.
And I wonder whether there is a reason for that, if there is actually a reason. Are we not going to have ghosts in 20 years, kind of thing?
Imagine in 20
is there
years,
a cut-off point?
You're looking at people with iPhones in 50 years.
Maybe there'll be someone.
I wonder if it's because the paranormal always belongs to the past. Like, you're probably as aware of this as anybody because you're from the British Isles. The fairy faith and the fairy tradition is often meant to have been something that was more prominent in the past and less prominent today. There seems to be a lot of those older laws and traditions, including hauntings, like you pointed out, tend to always harken back to some older time.
Yeah, it's interesting. And there's something I saw online a couple of weeks ago. There was an Irish girl, and she was talking about the Fae folk and how her grandmother, who speaks Gaelic Irish, was saying that the Fae folk themselves don't like to be called that, and it's a dirty insult. And there's other words for them. They prefer like something like the Shei or something Irish. And forgive me, Irish people. I'm of Irish descent, so whatever. It's interesting how times change and different words are there that we use that maybe are annoying these spirits or fae folk, unfortunately insulting them there again by calling them that. But then you have hundreds of thousands of people using that term now.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder whether these forest people or whatever you want to call them, or spirits or whatever they are, whether they're just ignoring us now and they're not haunting us as much, or they're not playing strange music in the forest anymore because they've just had enough of being called fae folk. Who knows?
Well, of course, the original tradition was meant to be that they were called fair folk or fairies or gentry because you didn't want to say anything bad about them, so you gave them nice names. So it's ironic in a way that now fae, which I guess is a derivative of fairy, which is a derivative of the fair folk. I think it's interesting that it's come full circle. Now those entities who used to be offended by if you didn't say they were nice, now they're offended by. Mind you, I'd be offended if somebody was referring to me as fae all the time. Good grief.
Yeah, especially if you're 9 feet tall, hairy, and you can make trees walk, and then someone's calling you fair. I'm not fair. I'm ferocious.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah. But back to ghosts and stuff. Sorry, cut you off.
Oh, you go. No, back to ghosts. That's fantastic.
No, I was just going to say the only other thing that's really been a constant in terms of ghosts and paranormal is shadow people. And I've had sleep paralysis twice in the last 2 years for the first time ever. I never had it before that, but shadow people and things being moved, your belongings, disappearing and turning up somewhere else where you know for a fact you left them there and they've moved, and then you look everywhere and then they're right where you did leave them, and it's almost as if there's some kind of block on you being able to see what's right in front of you for that amount of time, like a joke on you or something. But that's happened a few times. But yeah, the shadow people thing is it makes me wonder: are they the engineers behind the curtain that are making everything work? Are they just checking in on us, or are they spirits, or are they entities that were never human? What's going on?
Yeah.
A lot of people throw the word demon around, and I kind of cringe when I hear that, because I think it's a very Christian terminology, and aren't they just metaphors? And is there really anything to that? Why does everything have to be a demon? It doesn't, and it doesn't even relate. What if you're not even of that religion, and that doesn't apply? So what do you call them then? What is it? Maybe they do have all different kinds of names. What's going on? What are your thoughts, Jen?
Well, I
throw you in the deep end.
I've had sleep paralysis majority of my life. Actually, it wasn't until like the last 4 or 5 years that it's just kind of tapered off. It stopped. But yeah, I've experienced shadow people too. Mostly, as you mentioned, like silhouettes, and then they just kind of walk into your room. I think with the sleep paralysis, what I figured, what kind of helped me was that I actually fought with it. If that makes any sense. I wasn't scared. I wasn't just going to lay there and, try to, I literally got mad and had an altercation with it. And then it stopped. I don't know what the theory is, if there's a good theory behind that or not, but maybe if you just face your fears, it goes away. I don't know.
Yeah. That makes you wonder whether it is, and I'm not suggesting that this is it, but it makes you wonder whether it is just a part of our brain.
Could be.
Chemistry, electrical signals, maybe picking up radio shows in while you're asleep, and, some kind of awful things going on from you just hearing somebody else's thoughts even.
Yeah.
Or it's a spirit. I'm completely open to the idea that there is something going on and we're being visited. Absolutely. I don't see how you can't think that. And I think also, again, it's, we were saying earlier, it's not any one thing. It's every answer is the right answer. It's all of it, because it's all happening. There's no real one thing, because there's so many variations, again, on the family tree of all these different instances. It can't be one thing. And it can be all of those things. And I think that's probably the most frightening as well as fascinating aspects, because if there's a spectrum to this, then how deep and dark and awful and evil can that go? And I say evil, again, in a very sort of Christian terminology, but the very, very darkest, unfair part of nature, if you will.
Yeah.
The unavoidable death kind of thing. That's terrifying. But who knows? Who knows? Shadow people.
Yeah.
Are they just
Yes.
echoes? You know, they seem to be sentient. They seem to be more than just a ghost or a recording, don't they? They seem to sort of have an intention.
Yeah.
Especially when I've sort of bumped into them, or I've woken up and they've rushed into the room towards me.
Yes. Yes, I've had that.
From around a corner. That's happened twice, and
Yeah.
those were the two sleep paralysis things, where I was
Yes,
suddenly
that's
aware of someone coming into the room very quickly and straight up
Mhm.
towards me at the side of the bed.
Mhm.
And it was awful, and I woke myself up because I was audibly going, ah,
Oh,
you know, and
yeah.
that woke me up, my own self going,
Mhm.
and again, is that just because you're lacking oxygen and you're imagining you're replaying something, or are you being woken up by something that's trying to help you wake up because is it being helpful because you
Yeah.
don't have any air, or is it seeing you
Yeah.
vulnerable and it's rushing upon you like a
Mhm.
bird of prey?
Yeah. I had heard a theory with sleep paralysis, like when you're
Mm.
sleeping, you're astral projecting, and what it is when you're coming back into your body, and it's you waking up before the rest of your self comes in. And so that's why you feel like
Oh,
you're being rushed.
oh,
And I thought that was kind of interesting. Who knows
that's
if it's true,
interesting.
but
Yeah,
it kind of makes
yeah,
sense.
yeah. When you're sort of getting sucked back in there, it's like
Yeah.
the aspect of when you think you're falling off the edge of a cliff, you're
Mhm.
going to slide very quickly, and then you drop, don't you? And you
Mhm.
wake up with a bang, a jolt,
Yeah.
and not a bang, that'd be terrifying, but a jolt,
Yeah.
and then yeah, you sort of oh, I'm not falling, I'm
Mhm.
in bed, it's all right. But are you falling back into your body? Yeah,
Yeah.
that's interesting. That's
Mhm.
odd. That's odd. Shadow people. I saw a shadow cat. I call it a cat because it was sort of well the size of a cat, but it didn't
Mhm.
really look like a cat. But I hissed at it for some
Mhm.
reason. I was in my apartment in Hollywood maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and I woke up to this sensation of someone watching me. So I looked to my left, and I could see out of my doorway down the hall into the bathroom. And at the edge of my bedroom was this cat-sized, shadowy blob on the floor.
Mm.
And it was darker than the rest of the room that was dark. There was something there. And you sort of, but again, if you tilt your head, you could only sort of see it from not looking directly at it, if that makes sense. If you look
Mhm.
directly at it, you could kind of see through it. But if you look to
Mm.
the sort of right of it, you get a more solid view of it. It's very strange. But I threw the covers off, and I stepped one leg out of the bed onto the floor, and I leant forward and I just hissed at it because I had this overwhelming sensation that that's the only thing it would understand. Like it wouldn't
Yeah.
understand words if I said, go away.
Mhm.
I sort of hissed at it like an animal. And sure enough, it retreated into the bathroom. It sort of zoomed backwards, floated backwards, away from me into the bathroom down the hall. But everything was dark. And I looked again, and I, and I could see it was still there. And that's when I said to it, I can still see you. and it kind of wobbled a bit, and then it went straight up into the ceiling, and it was gone. And it was almost
Ah.
as if it was sort of saying to itself, "Oh, it can still see me." Sorry, I just swore there. I don't know if
So
this
good.
It's funny.
was. Yeah, it's got rumbled and it took off.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Huh.
very weird. I don't know what that was. Where the shadows are all the same thing and they just take the forms that are most convenient, or they are different shadows of different. It could have been my deceased cat paying a visit.
Could yeah.
He was probably really disappointed in me. Who
Mm.
knows?
It's interesting you said you had a background as being raised as an atheist.
Mm,
I know atheism doesn't necessarily imply that you don't believe in the supernatural. It more implies that you
sure.
don't believe in necessarily a God. But traditionally, in my experience, most atheists don't believe in any aspects of the supernatural, at least those that I've encountered or spoken to. Do you find that difficult to reconcile sometimes, the way you were raised or your initial belief systems with those kind of experiences and your interest in the paranormal?
That's a good question. That's a really good question, actually. All I can say is that I come from a Catholic family, in a sense that my grandmother was Catholic and grandfather. And so my mum and all of her brothers and sisters, there were 7 of them, big Irish Catholic family, were very much raised in a very strict and awful way, where there were nuns at school who would throw blackboard dusters at your head kind of thing. So when I was a kid, my mum said to me, when I came home from school one day with a Bible story, she said, "Oh, that's lovely, but if anyone ever asks, you say that you're an atheist until you decide what you want to be." And I thought, oh, great, okay. And I never, ever decided. I've left it, I suppose you'd call it agnostic, but I say atheist because I don't believe in a sort of a Abrahamic God, a Judeo-Christian God. I don't come from that aspect of God. I can sort of leave it open for the possibility of there being a higher power, a designer, if you will, but that's when I do doubt myself, and I think, no, see, you're just copping out. You just, like we said at the beginning, when people say, oh, well, then that must be a God because I can't understand this. I kick myself, and I really disappoint myself when I go there, because I think, no, there has to be something else. There has to be something else. And if the answer is a God, so be it. But to my knowledge, there's never been any proof to really sort of show me that there was this all-loving good God. Of course, we know that's not true anyway. Even the Bible says he's not very nice. It's the modern view that's twisted all of that into something else. And so that's why I'll come from an atheist point of view. It's like, I don't believe in that because it's changed so much. You can't, excuse the pun, but you can't put any faith in that. You really can't. It works for other people, and it's a brilliant thing, and it makes people have a really great sense of themselves and family and community and love and well-being, and people get together and they have these great times at churches. And I'm not knocking that in the slightest. It's just not for me, because I want more. I want the thing from deep space that speaks at 5 different languages at once, and doesn't have a face and things like that. To me, that aspect of religion and being agnostic is like, yeah, okay, I'm open to there being a higher entity or intelligence or some alien force or something that we literally do not have the words for or cannot grasp because we haven't discovered it. It's like if you could rewind time to a point where we hadn't had electricity. This is what we're at now, where there will probably come a time when we will look back and say, oh, remember when they didn't know what it was and they called it God. I think we're on the verge of that discovery where you look at the Hadron Collider and you look at the gravity waves that have been discovered, and you look at everything all connected to things that were supposed to not exist, and even the planets that harbor life. And there are now, we said, oh, at one point, oh yeah, we found 20 of them. Well, now we have 20 trillion of these Earth-like planets. Mm-hmm. And there was a time when we just didn't even see past our own planet, and yet you still have flat earthers walking around.
Yeah.
Boggles the mind. Boggles the mind.
It's funny because I'm a Christian, but I think some of the things you said then, I can imagine I don't know if you've read it or not. Have you ever read any of P.K. Dick's Valis series, like the book Valis or Radio Free Albemuth? Or
None of those, no.
I think you'd enjoy those books because you know who P.K. Dick is, of course, Blade Runner, and
Blade Runner, yep.
This whole kind of matrix view of science fiction without P.K. Dick. But P.K. Dick had these fascinating, very strange Gnostic spiritual experiences, which he wove into some of his later fiction. And I think the kind of his interpretation of the divine, because he was a Christian, but he was a Gnostic Christian, I think comes closer to some of those descriptions that you said you were more interested in, of that stranger, out there divine force.
It's the
I think you'd enjoy them. Read Valis. If you one day you'll knock it off in a day. It's such a great book. Like you'll just lose yourself in it. You'll go, wow. It's a fascinating book.
Yeah. I mean, those things. Again, it's any religion around the world. Just like the unexplained, have so many open ends and questions that they are all linked, and they all share a great number of similarities and even the stories and some of the details in the stories are identical in many cases from religions around the world that couldn't possibly have met. So they say. I mean, I'm sure they got a boat at some point, but it just makes you wonder, like the Great Flood, there are apparently 400 stories from around the world talking about the same thing. So again, back to the sort of the stew with all the different flavors and it being a stone at the bottom of it. That flood story clearly happened. It clearly was written into some memory somewhere. And so there are aspects of these old texts and, books of faith that can be looked upon as history. And yet there are aspects where people take too much of that on good faith as being fact when it clearly isn't. It's a metaphor or it's an example. Much in the way of soap operas today on television will dramatically portray a scene of a family on television, and something happens in maybe there's an affair going on, and so they show on television in that episode what's happening. And it's the same thing. It's educating people on what you would do in that situation. Here's what they did. Here's an example of what they did, and here are the consequences. And people sort of say, there's the book of life and how to live your life. And in many ways, I suppose that works for a lot of people. And maybe more people should read the Bible because there's a lot of foolish people out there that just don't seem to respect anything. You've got people walking around punching strangers for no reason. And it's an awful world we're in right now. It's really odd to sort of accept that this is where we've come to in the 21st century. I mean, how? It really is insane. And so maybe more people should go back in time and look at these original stories and think, hang on, we had it good at one point. Where did we go wrong? But I wouldn't put any faith in a God stepping in and helping us, because as we know, even from the Bible itself, he really didn't do much, did he? He sort of punished people more than anything else. And the guilt aspect doesn't help anyone, wherever you are.
It makes someone feel
bad. It's like,
I think you were right when you said there's this lovey-dovey version now, because the Bible is clear, the beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord, and, our God is a jealous God. So we do tend to look over some of the more, I suppose, vengeful aspects, particularly of the Old Testament. But now we go into theology and we say the New Testament resets and everything else. But what closer to our discussion, which interests me with the Bible, and we're well over time, but this is such a fascinating conversation, but is that books like Genesis 6, for example, which talk about the sons of God coming down and seeing the daughters of men were fair. There's a tradition throughout a lot of ancient cultures, whether of culture gods or cultural creators that descend from the heavens, and whether it's in the Book of Enoch or whether it's in Mesoamerican legends or whether it's in old Indian, as in India texts of things coming from the sky and somehow guiding us on a cultural advancement from where we were. And that's similar. When you were talking about the flood, it made me think of those stories as well, because they're very cross-cultural. The idea that there were knowledge bearers that came from elsewhere and somehow gave us a leg up. So I think there is some, and maybe it is just metaphor. Maybe it's just that we needed this to explain how we grew culturally. But it's interesting that it's similar stories across so many different cultures, that it was outsiders who gave us this knowledge. And that makes me think there's something in these older texts that is like the flood narrative, recalling something in distant memory that actually happened.
Yeah, I think as you quite rightly put it there, it is, it's a text that you can sort of look back on and leaf through and compare it to. I think you're referencing the Vimanas of India.
That's right. That was
the ships that came down, or these chariots of fire that ran through the sky, And it's funny, as you say, all these natives, when the big brave white man went over to all these countries and sort of civilized people, if you will, he was talking about their gods and oh, you don't want that God, you want this God, this is the best God, that God's rubbish. But they would always say that their God didn't come from across the sea or from around the mountain or from within the forest, or unless you're English, they always came from the sky, above. And that's just staring us in the face, isn't it, really? Where else would they come from? They didn't come from deep within the ocean or anything like that. And yet, yeah, we know more about space than our own oceans. That's crazy. What's down there? That's another conversation.
We could go. Ivan Sanderson talked about that quite a bit. I think it was in Invisible Residence. But we've talked to you, I think, longer than any guest we've ever had on the show, Sam. Because we normally try to make it around an hour. So we've never hit an hour and 15 before. You're the first.
Oh, I do ramble. Yeah.
And it was a wonderful conversation. Why don't you tell us a little bit about how people can check out your fantastic artwork and keep up to date with all your upcoming projects, including your podcast, so they're ready to listen as soon as it releases.
Oh, thanks very much. This has been great. It's been really fun talking to you both. And
thank you.
I'd love to do it again at some point.
Absolutely.
And maybe we can talk about the deep ocean. Who knows?
Yeah.
The podcast. I was originally going to be launching it last month, but a number of amazing things landed on my table, and I just couldn't pass them up. So I've sort of postponed that. So hopefully this month, maybe we're going to be launching the new podcast. But until then, to stay tuned and sort of sign up to the mailing list so you get all the notifications. Instagram, Twitter, everything is all on one website. All the links are on one website, which is MrSamShearon.com. And Mr. is in the word MISTER, Sam, S-A-M, and then Shearon is SHEARON, Mister Sam Shearon. So just head there. Instagram, there's a Patreon link on there as well. Print store, as I say, mailing list, and just go and check it out. Have a look at some weird things.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. You were an incredible guest, and as I'm sure that you will, keep it weird.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Keep it weird.
Take care.
Thank you for joining us tonight. If you're interested in checking out more episodes, you can find us at talkingweird.com. If you haven't already, please like the show on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Talking Weird Podcast. Make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing to Talking Weird. We're available on most podcast platforms and YouTube. And if you do enjoy the show, please leave us a review. Dean and I would really appreciate it. Until then, stay safe and